Thank you, everybody, for your patience while we get the slide situation figured out right now. Here we are. All right, we're ready to rock, everybody. Thank you for your patience. My name is Rowan Curran. Let's get going. So, to start off, how does this sound make you feel? Does it make you feel excited? Does it make you feel nervous or scared? I bet each of us has different feelings about these kind of visualizations and this kind of sound, but to me, that's the sound of adventure, and I love adventure. In fact, this is me on an adventure last summer in the Arctic of Alaska, exploring the wilderness. And I don't know what your opinion on the wilderness is, but I find it a very rich environment to explore new challenges and new rewards. And the reason I'm talking to you about this today is because AI is a wilderness unto itself. But just like my first time in the Arctic wasn't my first time in the wilderness, our projects in AI are not our first forays into the wilderness of unknown technology. So I want to take us all on a trip into the wilderness and help us plan, prepare, and bring the right people along with us in order to be successful. Because there's a lot of challenges out here in the world of AI and generative AI, but there's also a lot of rich rewards to be reaped. So let's talk about AI. The adventure into the new world of AI applications has really brought us to a new place in the past couple years, and our customers are ready to go on this journey with us. Now, when we look at the AI space, sorry, I'm having some issues with the slides. Apologies about that. So our customers are going with us on the AI journey, but we have this strange disconnect between the results that we've gotten from AI projects so far and what the executives that we work with are seeing as the benefits here. So from our survey data last year, we saw that 59% of companies had seen cost savings from their AI projects. 47% coming up close behind had seen revenue increases from their AI projects, but still only 43% of senior leaders who had had companies with those types of results actually could connect it to the business. And so closing this gap of understanding and the benefits is part of what we need to accomplish today. And we're not going to achieve all of this, but we're going to get a bit farther along the way. So let's get back into the AI wilderness itself. So to make our way into the AI wilderness, it's very important that we bring the right planning, we have the right people, and we have the right gear with us as well. And we need to make sure to stitch it all together in the best way possible. And so as we go into this wilderness, it's important to also recognize the lay of the land. We need to take a step back and look at the entire landscape. And within this landscape, there are a couple of different flavors of AI that I'm going to break out for us in a brief taxonomy to help us better understand what types of use cases we can go after and what types of technologies might be appropriate for them. So, to start us off, I actually just want to touch on the fact that while I'm going to be talking about both predictive and generative AI today, mostly generative AI, when we're looking at the types of applications and systems that we're building, it's really important to bring both of these things together. We can't just rely on predictive algorithms, and we can't just rely on things like large language models and GANs and diffusion models to provide our most effective applications. So, to that end, let's take a moment to talk about predictive AI first, because while I imagine many of you want to talk about generative AI, we need to have our vegetables before we can have our nice, delicious sweets. So, predictive AI. Predictive AI has been around for a number of years. You know, we may have called it machine learning or predictive analytics in years past, but it's a very broad space in the enterprise. And so the way that you can think about predictive AI is that it is generally used to predict a single thing, and it's generally trained on structured data. So while this is not a perfect taxonomy, this is a good way of breaking out these two categories from each other. So if we look at predictive AI, this can be seen as everything from the most basic descriptive statistics all the way up to mathematical-based optimization and other types of segmentation and predictive algorithms, as you can see on the periodic table here. Now, when it comes to predictive AI, we've been able to build a number of different use cases and applications for this over the past 10 years or so. And we've been doing things like creating classification algorithms to identify whether customers are actually going to buy something on our site, as well as clustering algorithms to determine whether customers fit into the same segment as others, even down to anomaly detection for fraud or association to see whether someone's going to buy a product along with another product as well. Now, when we look at the use cases for predictive AI, we can see we can see a number of common ones. So we have a ton of use cases for predictive AI in decision support and insight. So being able to predict whether a customer is going to churn, what our sales forecast is for next year, all of these things that allow us to take kind of direct actions in our enterprise. We also have real-time customer interactions. So many of us have probably experienced this type of predictive analytics already today. When we went to a particular website and it gave us a particular piece of content that was oriented towards our interests and our preferences, and that was created by using a predictive model. We also have a number of use cases in supply chain optimization around the correct sourcing of stocks and the correct routing of particular goods. But we also have some very interesting use cases in supply chain optimization that involve computer vision. So we have some folks who have been using computer vision to analyze the widgets that they're producing at their factories and actually identify whether there's going to be a need for some kind of redistribution or some kind of optimization in terms of how those widgets are delivered. And finally, we're also seeing lots of use cases in fraud detection, whether that be in financial services, basic web security, or other use cases. So with predictive AI, there's a number of different use cases across a number of different industries, and they all focus around structured data and single predictions. Now, let's click over to generative AI. With generative AI, this is much more focused on taking a large set of data that is oftentimes unstructured and then creating a whole new data set out of it on the other side. And the impacts of generative AI go far beyond the business world. We are probably all have been talking about how this is going to disrupt our business, how it's going to change our recruiting strategies, all these different types of things. But it's important to be very cognizant that generative AI specifically is not just going to affect us in our businesses and in our work lives. It's going to have a much broader impact across the entire globe and across all the societies that we exist within. So there's lots of things that we need to think about in terms of the way that we recruit people. So lots of folks who are in university right now, my kind of main line right now is think about everybody who entered university in 2023. All of those folks are never going to have had a university experience that did not have the accessibility of large language models available to them. And that is likely to lead to the same type of mind shift that we saw when we had folks of my generation coming up, where we were much more oriented towards having a Google-like brain and just being able to search and find everything rather than having to memorize everything as in the past. So there's a ton of different use cases for generative AI that kind of reach broadly across the landscape. But the way that generative AI has progressed, we can kind of see as same types of impacts as we saw from the transition to command line to GUI interfaces, and from file transfers to more streaming systems, and even from the to touch screens and to natural language interfaces. This is going to be a paradigm shift in the way that we interact with technology and also the underlying processes and systems that drive that technology itself. Now, when we look at what generative models are actually creating, they're whole data sets. And the way that you can think about this is that, a paragraph is a whole data set. A photo is a whole data set. A video is a whole data set. A piece of audio is a whole data set. There are multiple different data points that are being generated by these models. So when we look at generative models, it's important to consider the differences between them and more traditional models. And today, when I talk about generative models, I'm not just talking about large language models, though that's going to be the focus of my discussion. When we think about the generative landscape, it's very important that we remember that we also have to think about generative adversarial networks for synthetic data generation. We have to think about diffusion models for image generation. And then increasingly, we're going to have to think about multimodal language models that incorporate images, text, and other modalities into their generations. Now, sorry, okay, so now the generative AI use cases are extensive. So these are use cases that we got from our surveys last fall when asking users about what types of use cases they were planning to implement in the next 12 months around generative AI. Now, as you can see, there's a whole bunch of use cases represented up here that are from a number of different approaches, both customer-facing and also employee-facing. But what we've seen overall as people progress through their generative AI journey is that the people who are the most savvy and the most successful tend to focus on internal-facing use cases for what they're deploying today. So as you can see from the data behind me, when we look at folks who are very early in their generative AI journey, when they're just exploring and educating themselves about generative AI, the focus, though it's very slight, is on customer-facing use cases, pardon me. And as you can see, when we hit that middle point, when people transition from exploring to actually experimenting and expanding, building their use cases out, that's when they start to focus on the internal-facing use cases overall. Now, when we look at the landscape, predictive AI and generative AI, again, really need to come together in order to perform best. But now let's look more specifically at our generative AI journey and how we're going to go about this. So, to start off with, we'll look at how we're actually going to plan our organization for this adventure. So, we have this planning, the people, and the goods, and we need to put it all together with adaptability. Because as we're building AI projects and generative AI projects, it's really important to keep in mind this very experimental mindset. Because it's very likely that your first project is not going to result in a huge ROI for the company. It may, but it's very likely, particularly with generative AI, that you're going to have to go through multiple iterations and multiple steps of experimentation. And this is largely true to the fact that large language models have a lot of unknowns about them, and we're still learning how to work with them. So when we look at the generative landscape, I'm going to take you through 3 different models of how we can start to acquire these capabilities. I'm going to look at 3 different ways of going on an adventure. So we have first here, we're going to talk about a cruise ship, then we're going to talk about an adventure cruise, and then we're going to talk about a river rafting trip. So the adventure cruise to kick off. So this approach you can think of as kind of when you're getting generative AI as a fully managed experience. And that comes into play when you're looking at generative AI as an embedded capability from within your existing applications. And this can be a very good approach for acquiring capabilities that are in high demand and that you need to deploy very quickly. So for example, we're seeing lots of folks use things like co-pilots and code assistants from their providers because they offer built-in guardrails and help manage the inputs and outputs and very quickly get these solutions deployed out to the employees that want to use them. And then additionally, these solutions are increasingly also able to offer you the ability to integrate your own data into the experience so that you can more effectively ground the responses. So if you're going to go on a cruise ship, you're going to get a fully managed adventure, and it's going to allow you to not have as much tech investment from your side to actually build this out. Now, maybe you're feeling a little bit more flexible, a little bit more like you can explore the wilderness a bit further on your own. Well, if you're going that route, or sorry, actually, before we get there, I apologize. We're going to talk about co-pilots at Dentsu very quickly. So Dentsu is a good example of one of the early companies who is actually launching co-pilots at their company. So they have deployed co-pilots across several hundred employees and are actively iterating and evolving this project. And so what they've started to see from this is that there's a significant amount of time savings and productivity gain from these employees with this managed experience. And what this is allowing them to do is also connect deeper into that Microsoft ecosystem and graph by using the Microsoft Copilot. But what they've started to see in terms of the benefits is time savings of about 20 minutes per day per user and up to 40 minutes per day for some users. Now, we'll talk a bit more about what that kind of like time savings and the productivity gains around generative AI mean as we get farther into the back end of the presentation. But it's important to recognize that when we're looking at the ROI and the measure of generative AI impacts, that we can't measure the impact across all employees in a very kind of gross way where we paint everybody with the same brush. So moving on to our adventure cruise. This is an approach where you're going to have a bit more control over your experience, but there's also going to be some more work that's needed on your part. So going on an adventure cruise is where we see a lot of folks going today when they want to build out a more custom experience. So they want to go a bit farther than where the vendors have gone at this point in time. So these folks are leveraging vendor-provided SaaS large language models or open source models from the cloud. They're also leveraging this to build custom applications. And this is basically allowing them to build more complex workflows and to actually interact with the model in a more nuanced way so that they can get more precise results for whatever their use case is. And this is also allowing them to adapt to the model behavior more specifically. So controlling those inputs, adding things like grounding prompts, working further on prompt engineering, doing things like plan and solve reasoning and whatnot to further focus the results and get better responses from the model. Now, an example of a company that is doing this is the Mayo Clinic. They're using the Google Cloud Platform and the generative AI app builder to build an experience that is attacking a key problem around not being able to research patient conditions across a number of different data sources. So they use the generative AI app builder combined with the models provided by Google to basically build a retrieval augmented generation setup that allows them to do better research on these patient conditions, allows them to deliver better content experiences to end users, because now they're able to wrap up the insights from these databases with the language model and present it to an end user in a very effective way. And then finally, that's resulting in a better patient experience overall. Now, what if we want to go the full send and we want to go on a generative AI river rafting adventure? Well, this can be the most exciting, the most rewarding, but it also requires the most work on our part. So when we're looking at a river rafting experience for generative AI, this is where you're going to have a lot more control over managing the cost and performance on your own infrastructure, because you'll be bringing in open source models to run, whether it's in your own virtual private cloud or your own data center, whatever it may be. You have much more control over the performance and the inferences of that model. Additionally, you're also able to create query input controls. So you have an even greater degree of control and how you're interacting with that model and how you're getting insights from it. And you're also able to manage the content output and quality. So while in many of the vendor-provided solutions, there's tooling to basically analyze the output of the model to reduce bias, eliminate toxicity, identify brand voice, and do other things of that nature. If you're taking the river rafting adventure, you're able to build these output controls yourself and get a much tighter set of controls around this. Additionally, when you have control over the input and output controls and you have these models in your own environment, it can be much easier to build a more complex architecture where you're stitching multiple models together in a more complex workflow, which is what we're starting to see in the more advanced users. And additionally, you can also get better transparency to model behavior and data. And then finally, in this river rafting adventure, you can also start to look at doing more advanced things like leveraging a vector database to support retrieval augmented generation. Now, retrieval augmented generation can be applied in any one of these scenarios, but if you're going to be building it yourself, this is where you want to go. So those are kind of the three main routes to acquiring generative AI. We see folks getting the embedded capabilities from their providers. We see folks building out capabilities on top of the cloud-based services. And then we also see folks building their own capabilities with open source models as well. Now, what's important to note about all this is that you're not going to be taking just one of these adventures. You're going to actually be taking possibly all three. So a quick example of the river rafting adventure for you. So this is a leading tech company who's working with a company called ClearGPT, and they were actually using large language models in combination with a chatbot to provide a better internal technology experience to their users. And so they leveraged Llama 2 and fine-tuned Llama 2 on a question and answer set of data from their Slack channel that was able to then support accurate answers to their employees. And so what this then also, and then they also added a continuous feedback collection mechanism so that they could understand the user responses, how good the answers were, and actually refine the model over time. And what they saw as the result of this implementation was a greater than 75% decrease in the tier 1 requests that were coming into the system, and they actually saw an increase in the quality of customer experience, and this is internal customers, employees, not external customers, an increase in the quality of customer experience when interacting with the tech management system and interacting with the help desk. So these can have very significant and powerful results when you start to implement generative AI into your systems. And then finally, sorry, I almost forgot this part, they deployed the final version as an API. So they didn't just deploy it as a chatbot in the final version, they actually deployed it as an internal platform that was able to be leveraged by other parts of the organization. So not only did they think about kind of this first order use case around the customer service and support, but they were thinking ahead about what are the subsequent use cases that I might want to use this data set for. So with that, we've kind of gone through the three main ways for folks to approach generative AI and to acquire it within their organization. And now I'm going to very quickly touch on one organization who's actually taken multiple routes of the ones that we just looked at to acquire generative AI. So AT&T is actually using generative AI both from the cruise ship approach as well as from the adventure cruise approach. So with the cruise ship approach, they're using co-pilots to help support their internal folks to drive better productivity and better insights in terms of how they're generating content. And then they're also using the adventure cruise approach to help bring in Code Llama and some other tools to support their developers so that they can migrate their old school distributed code to a more modern architecture, not just to bring it into the modern architecture for its own sake, but to increase security and also to allow them to produce more efficient services with more modern languages on top of it. And for both of these things, they're seeing significant productivity benefits and impacts on their organization. Now, once we have the right planning in place for generative AI, we actually need to get the right people on board as well. And one of the really important parts around getting the people on board is considering all the new factors that are involved here. So one of the great things about generative AI is how excited so many people are about it. So we have this really nice complementary energy from the bottom up and the top down that is giving us both frontline employees and execs of real enthusiasm around this. And so there's a lot to capture about that by doing user groups, having internal hackathons, and otherwise soliciting input from all the internal folks that may be excited about generative AI. And then we also need to get diverse perspectives on our core AI teams. I think that, especially with generative AI, people have gotten very excited about this. And while they initially tried to build very kind of, hybridized and multidisciplinary teams, there has been a bit of a separation from some groups from the generative AI initiatives. And I think it's really important for all of us to keep in mind that it's important to have not just, the business stakeholders and stuff like that involved in our generative AI leadership teams, but also folks from compliance and security and these other teams that may have some real concerns about how we're building these applications so that we can start to allay those concerns and actually roll out these applications that we need to. And then we also need to adjust and adapt to emerging skill sets. So one of the things with generative AI is that we've seen new ways of interacting with models that we have never really had to deal with before and that we're now having to upskill around. So I think, probably one of the most prominent examples is prompt engineering, which, if I had said, what is prompt engineering to all of you 18 months ago, I think that the percentage of people who would have had, a clear and well-articulated answer would have been very small. And prompt engineering, while, it's not going to be, a $500,000 a year job like many folks were kind of talking about over their past year, it is going to be an essential skill set of building these applications. Now, it's yet to be determined whose essential skill set it is. We see it in developers, we see it in business folks, but who is going to need to be the best prompt engineer is yet to be determined. But then there's also other skill sets that really haven't quite been talked about to the same degree as well. So we mentioned vector databases earlier. With the vector databases, there's additional skills and considerations that need to be brought into the fold because you need to think about how you're actually vectorizing your information. So when you're creating a vector for a vector database, you're essentially turning a piece of content into a number. Now, if you turn a whole document into that embedding or into that vector, that is going to have a very different ability to find similarities as if you put each sentence of that document separately as a vector into that database. Now, that may seem like a little esoteric to you as I just laid it out, but this is another one of the emerging skill sets that you're going to have to start to think about and capture within the generative AI space. And then finally here we have maintaining governance while encouraging innovation. So it's very important to have some kind of AI governing team or a generative AI leadership team to encourage the innovation, but also to make sure that you don't run into a situation where you have a ton of patchwork deployments, lots of spaghetti code, and a lot of shadow IT emerging across the organization, which is definitely something we saw start to happen at some teams last year. Now, there's also a few things that we need to change in our organizations really quickly. So we need to change how we think about hiring. and we changed how we think about training. So we talked a bit about the hiring before, but changing how we think about training comes down to, how do we actually upskill folks in terms of both working with these large language models, but also in terms of how do we leverage generative AI to help train people better. So a good example of this at a very simple level would be using a large language model supported chatbot to train a new salesperson or a new help desk employee. Because basically you have created a scenario where they can interact with a chatbot that could be set up to be a very irate customer or some other adverse scenario, and that person can be trained to actually achieve whatever is considered success in that scenario and do it in a low risk and a low stakes way. Now, we also need to start thinking about changing how we think about customer behavior. In the same way that Google changed the way our customers think about search and had all of them saying, well, I just need Google for my organization, ChatGPT has done the exact same thing. I have had so many conversations over the past year where people say to me, I just need ChatGPT for my enterprise. And when you drill down on that, oftentimes it's much, much, much more complicated than that. But the expectation from the consumers is really that they can have a ChatGPT-like experience within their enterprise environments and with their enterprise technologies. Now, we have some frameworks at Forrester to approach this. And the first one that we developed was developed by my colleague JP Gowner back in 2017 as the robotics quotient. And this is a framework that basically helps you assess how ready your organization is to deal with robotic process automation and with other types of automation. And while that was great for 2017, now we have evolved it forward. So now we have what we call the AI quotient. And this is a framework that approaches all of the uncertainties and all of the new questions that are introduced with AI broadly and specifically with generative AI. So you're going to need to consider, these benefits, these risks, and these costs of generative AI through a new light as you assess how your organization can progress to success here. And there's going to be some challenges along the way, but I think one of the things to approach here when we're thinking about how to get our people ready for this is that even as we are going on whatever type of adventure we're going on, there's going to be a need to allow folks to kind of wander off on their own hikes as needs come up. So we suggest that folks take a very positively engaging bring your own AI approach, or BYOAI. And essentially what this means is creating an environment where you have a policy that supports the security and privacy of your organization and helps employees understand what steps they have to take to safeguard sensitive information and protect themselves in the organization. These policies also focus around usage of BYOAI. So what tools can you use that are external? What tools can you not use that are external? What tools can you replace externally with internal products and services? And then we have the support. How is IT actually going to manage bring your own AI moving forward? So we've seen most IT organizations that are doing this right take a very empathetic and proactive approach to engaging with their colleagues and with other employees. So they're basically saying, hey, we understand that you really want to use this technology, but we're not going to tell you just flat out no, the same way that we told you no when BYOD kind of came up in the mid-2010s. Now it's a much more partner-oriented approach where we're seeing folks do things like have basically a safe harbor conversation with some of their internal employees by doing things like saying, hey, are you using generative AI already? Just tell me whatever you're using it for. It's okay if it's not approved usage. I just need to know what you're using it for so I can build you a use case that is actually going to meet the needs that you're already acting upon. And then finally, though, probably most importantly, is this literacy piece. So it's helping employees really understand what the capabilities and what the limits are and how to use AI responsibly at work. And so this involves things like helping folks understand how to deal with the non-deterministic system. It deals with things like helping folks understand sort of how they are actually going to question a system when it's incorrect. Now, this brings us kind of to the tail end here, where we're going to look at the gear that we need to bring on our generative AI adventure. So when we look at the AI space, there's a number of different things that we've seen for years. We have model ops, we have training, we have all these things. But with generative AI, there's some very specific things that we need to consider, and we need to question our providers and our own gear in terms of whether it has these capabilities. So I'm going to start off with the one that is probably actually the least relevant and the fewest of us are doing today, and that's model pre-training. So most folks are not pre-training their own generative models today, but we are seeing an emerging array of vendor tools that are coming out to facilitate folks pre-training their own large language models. So you have folks like Lightning AI, you have SambaNova, you have Mosaic ML that was acquired by Databricks last year. All of these companies have pipelines that are designed to make it easier and more efficient to train large language models. Then we have fine-tuning capability. So every large language model can be fine-tuned, but depending upon what platform you're working with, what tool set you're working with, there's going to be greater or lesser degrees of capability for introducing a data set to fine-tune and for having a well-defined pipeline for how to add that new data to your language model and to further direct its behavior. We also have, I don't know why that build went that way, we also have questions around model input and output controls. So these are things like prompt engineering, like I discussed before, and all these more advanced approaches to prompt engineering as well. So doing things like plan and solve reasoning, which is essentially where you're asking a language model to not just answer a query for you, but to actually develop a plan to solve that query in your enterprise system. And then on the right here, we also have testing and simulation capabilities. So when we're working with generative AI and large language models specifically, it's basically impossible to say this model is definitely going to work for this use case over here because I know that this model is really suited for these use cases. It is the case that some models are better or worse at certain tasks. And so you can start to kind of shape your thinking about what models to use around that. But when it comes to actually building this out in the enterprise and what model you're going to use for a specific piece of functionality, that really comes down to actually testing it in the environment against the responses that you're interested in and seeing what the results are. And then finally, over here on the right, we have model orchestration. So this is basically extending the world of model ops to now include large language models. Some folks have referred to this as LLM ops. I think that that is an unhelpful term that is not actually going to help us build applications into the future. So really, I look at this as model orchestration in the generative AI space. And over time, this is going to filter back into the broader space of model ops and ML ops. And you can already see this happening with a couple of different platforms that are out there. So DataRobot added a new template into their model monitoring platform for them to be able to support large language models. And then you have folks like EPAM who released into the open source a framework called Rail that is basically a way of managing and deploying and orchestrating large language models into production. And could I get a time check from the podium? Because my timer is not counting down here.
Yeah, we are almost. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Please feel free to grab me later on in the conference. It's been great to chat with you today, and have a great one.
For more content on tech and leadership, subscribe to NASScom YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.